Hi everyone. I'm about to read to you a short story that I recently published on Amazon. It's a horror story, so it's very different from the typical content that I produce on TikTok as well as on this channel. I feel like it's my responsibility, though, to first give a content warning because there's a lot of graphic language in this story, as well as depictions of sexual violence that a lot of people might find disturbing. So, if this is not the content that you'd be interested in listening to or reading, completely understand. And I also want to mention that if you are in a bad headspace right now, I wouldn't recommend you listen or read this story at least right now. But if you are interested, it's a story that is about a child and kind of explores a child's early perspective of their parents. When I was young, I kind of looked at my parents as godlike figures, people who could really do no wrong. Obviously, as I got older, I realized that really wasn't the case. And I feel like this discovery that we all go through ultimately leads to our loss of innocence as children. And this story explores that in a very dramatic and horrifying way. So, that's a little bit about what it's about. But I'm going to begin reading. And of course, if you watch this video and you listen to my reading, it's of course free, it's on YouTube. However, if you want your own electronic copy, you can click the link below and you can order a copy from Kindle for 99 cents. So, that said, here's my story, and I hope you enjoy. The Big House in Buffalo. His name was Jimmy and he was 10. Jimmy was a roughhouser, and liked tackling his friends or giving them the occasional Charlie horse when they least expected. Jimmy's friends often became annoyed with his irritating and sometimes violent antics. However, what Jimmy lacked in social skills, he made up for in generosity. He would often bring goodies to his classmates that his mother made the night before, a gesture that would likely make up for his frequent tomfoolery. Jimmy wasn't the best student. He was seldom calm, rarely raised his hand, and wouldn't always pay attention. He was, however, obedient and quickly apologetic to his adult superiors, and for this reason, many teachers never felt the need to challenge him. Jimmy had one teacher who wasn't as forgiving of the late assignment, yet neither was as afraid of losing her lunchtime for extra office hours. Mrs. Russo, who also happened to be Jimmy's favorite teacher, lived in a small house about a mile from the school. She lived alone for as long as she could remember and hadn't remarried since her husband was shot and killed in Vietnam. She was a lonely woman, and this was, unknown to Mrs. Russo, often a topic of discussion in the break room between the other school faculty. Most days after school, Mrs. Russo enjoyed several pours of Cabernet, along with a pill or two before running a hot bath. On the weekends, she liked reading at her favorite park bench, where she could hear the roars of Niagara Falls. She didn't like that she was prone to random crying outbursts, whether it was at home or in the school parking lot. She loved teaching, and although it sounded to her rather hokey, she loved watching her students learn. She disliked much of the public school curriculum that often forced her to hand out mass-produced learning packets written by inept bureaucrats. She always did her best to keep her students' interest alive, since it was inevitable that the majority of her class wouldn't reach the end of high school. For today's lesson, every student was to give a written presentation on whom they considered to be their hero. All right, everyone, get out your papers. I'm going to pick on our first presenter shortly, said Mrs. Russo. A scraggly boy with jet black hair sitting behind Jimmy took the eraser edge of his number 2 pencil and gave Jimmy a jab on the shoulder. Hey, Jimmy, Tommy said. Yeah, Jimmy replied. Were you adopted? Asked Tommy. No, why? You look Italian, but your parents don't look Italian. You know your dad looks like that guy from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? He's got that blonde hair and mustache. I never saw it, said Jimmy. Your dad looks more like a cowboy, but not Italian. You look Italian. I think that's why my mom doesn't mind you coming over. Jimmy, slightly annoyed, replied, I'm not Italian. I didn't say you were. I said that's probably why she doesn't have a problem with you. Or maybe she knows you live in Bryant, so she thinks you're probably not trouble. Hey, when are you going to let me play Pong? I don't know. I guess whenever we go to the arcade, said Jimmy. No, no, no. I'm talking about your house. You said the other day you have Pong. What? Were you lying? Shut up. I wasn't lying, said Jimmy. My mom gets headaches and I can't make noise. If we get too loud, my dad will kill me. I don't even play with the sound on. You sure it's not because I'm Italian? No. My mom gets headaches, stupid. It's not because you're Italian. It's because you're an idiot, said Jimmy. Now shut up before I give you a smack across the face. Having heard a bit of their bickering, Mrs. Russo turned to the two boys. Jimmy and Tommy, it seems you are both in a talkative sort of mood today, she said. How about you guys start off the presentations? Mrs. Russo, Tommy is bothering me, whined Jimmy. Perfect. Thank you for volunteering, Jimmy, said Mrs. Russo. Whenever you're ready, please go to the front of the class. Jimmy nervously grasped his paper as he walked to the presenter's spot next to Mrs. Russo. He ran his fingers through his dark brown hair, cleared his throat of any phlegm, and began reading. Today I want to talk about my hero, James Russell Girardi Jr. This is my dad. Jimmy paused as he was suddenly interrupted by a spontaneous orchestra of backroom snickers. Enough now, demanded Mrs. Russo. Jimmy, please carry on. My dad's name is James, but his friends like to call him Jim. He's a carpenter, so he builds houses. My dad likes to build houses, and he's very good at it. When I was just a baby, my dad bought an old house on Robert Street. I don't remember, but they told me the house was very creepy and had a bunch of bugs and cobwebs and things. My mom told me that when they first bought the house, all the windows were broken, the toilet was broken, and there was no place to go to the bathroom. For a while, when my mom and dad were still fixing the house, they had to go to the bathroom outside. Jimmy's revelation about his parents' prior waste removal practices was just too much for the classroom to handle. The children burst into laughter. Quiet now, yelled Mrs. Russo. Jimmy continued. But my dad fixed up the house and made it our home. We have a huge basement and an attic. My dad told me that our house is the biggest house on Robert Street, and it's the nicest too. Our house is even bigger than Dr. Stan's down the street, and my dad says that's something to brag about because Dr. Stan is a real medical doctor, not one of those fake doctors that... Before Jimmy could finish his thought, Mrs. Russo chimed in. Remember the assignment, Jimmy. Let's talk more about your hero. Jimmy smiled slightly. Yes. Sorry, Mrs. Russo. It's okay. I just want to hear why your dad is a hero to you. Jimmy cleared his throat once more and continued. Yes, my dad is a hero because he is a great carpenter. Do you know that Jesus was a carpenter too? My dad told me that being a carpenter is very hard, and it makes him very tired. My dad still does it though, and if my dad didn't build houses, then people wouldn't have a place to live. So carpenters are very important to the world. Thank you. Very good, Jimmy, said Mrs. Russo. Come on, everyone, let's give him a round of applause. The classmates clapped their hands unenthusiastically before welcoming Tommy to give his presentation. No one in the class, including Mrs. Russo, was surprised to learn that Tommy's hero was Rocky Marciano. The day proceeded with several rounds of bumbling monologues before the bell rang, marking the end of the school day. Jimmy quickly grabbed his bag and overcoat and walked to the doorway before noticing the beckoning hand of Mrs. Russo. Jimmy, can you please come here for a second? Mrs. Russo said softly. She proceeded to pull out a blue and white pie tray from her top desk drawer that had been clearly washed the night before. Jimmy, please tell your mother that this was heavenly, she stated as she handed him the tray. Your mother truly is an angel for going through all this work. I need to make her something. I know what. I'm going to make her my apple turnover. Does your mother like apple turnover? I'm not sure, replied Jimmy. Well, I'm going to make some for you to bring her this Friday. Now, I'm not as good of a cook as your mom, that's obvious. But people who don't even like apple turnover like this recipe. Mrs. Russo, we don't need any food. We have so much food at home. Jimmy, I'm sure your mom would like the gesture. Besides, it would be rude if I didn't make her something since she made me her wonderful lasagna. But my mom didn't make that for you, Mrs. Russo. What? Mrs. Russo looked puzzled. If she didn't make it for me, then who did she make it for? I don't know. I think us, said Jimmy. We always have so many leftovers. All the time. Did you ask your mom if it was okay for me to have this food? Said Mrs. Russo sternly. We have so many leftovers, said Jimmy frantically. My mom puts them in the freezer a lot, but when we warm them up, they taste weird. Mrs. Russo pursed her lips and asked Jimmy slowly, Did you ask your mom? Yes or no? No, he said. Jimmy tilted his head toward the direction of the floor. Okay, Jimmy. It's not good that you took your mom's food. That's stealing. How'd you like it if you worked hard to make something and someone took that away from you without asking? With his head bowed, Jimmy replied, I wouldn't like it. That's right. I'm happy that you like me, but please never bring anything unless you ask your mom or dad first, okay? Jimmy looked up to see Mrs. Russo's warm smile. He smiled back and gave her a nod. Now put this in your bag and be very careful with it. You already took her food. It would be a real shame if you broke her dish. And go home before it gets too cold. It's freezing out there. Okay. See you tomorrow, Mrs. Russo. Jimmy placed his mother's tray in his backpack as he scurried out of the classroom. He didn't go home, but instead headed to the frozen field behind the gymnasium. During the hotter, swampy months when the ground was soft, Jimmy and the other rambunctious boys were always eager to play a full-contact game of football. Today, the ground was as hard as concrete, so the boys reluctantly agreed to play a winner's game of two-hand touch. When Jimmy arrived, the boys were already divvying up pieces of a used ripped burgundy t-shirt and an old pair of brown trousers. The teams were divided into 3 and 2 with Sam, Tommy, and Pete as the Browns, and Billy and Jimmy as the Reds. Jimmy and Billy were faster for their age, and because of their realized physical superiority over the rest of their classmates, the two had developed a bond. Although they never told each other so, the two were undoubtedly closest friends, at least for the past few months. They shared interests like football and Saturday morning cartoons. In July, they would cast rusty hooks encrusted with old hot dogs into Erie Lake in a futile attempt to catch perch. They also both liked fudge pops from the ice cream truck or Entenmann's cakes from the corner bodega. They seldom visited each other's houses, partly because Billy lived in an area of Grand Ferry that Mrs. Girardi considered too packed with coloreds. Jimmy would neither attempt to invite Billy to his house since he didn't want to worsen his mother's migraines. Billy's mother, on the other hand, was no longer alive and had died from carcinoma when he was just an infant. Billy's father was still around, if you could call it that. He would occasionally make money pouring concrete, only to spend his little earnings on a 12-pack of Labatt Blues or a fifth of Jim Beam. Therefore, Billy had to rely on his sister Lisa for most things. Lisa spent most of her tireless nights at the Shelley's train cart diner, waiting on the many truckers stopping along their midnight journeys to Cleveland. Every night, Lisa would come home, usually around 3 a.m., and would bring with her the smell of stale cigarettes, spilt burnt coffee, and the little remnants of tomato sauce of yesterday's spaghetti parm. When she arrived home, she used any tiny bit of energy she had left in a hopeless attempt to clean the stockpile of dirty dishes in the sink or the empty beer cans left on the carpet. She usually found her father comatose in his pullback chair, both arms dangling to the sides. Whenever she heard him gargle his own spit upon inhaling, it took every nerve in her body not to deck him in the face with the nearest heavy object. However, Lisa's internal rage had subsided at least for this week, since her father had proven to not be entirely useless. Recently, her dad managed to get a gig pouring concrete at a warehouse that just so happened to be a bid to Girardi Construction. Her father boastfully recounted that while on the job, he was able to sneak in a cigarette break and get a word with Mr. Girardi himself. The conversation went something like, "Our kids go to school together, and I have a daughter that works late nights at Shelley's, but she would rather have a day job. She's a smart gal." Through this interaction, Lisa got a job as a bookkeeper for Girardi Construction. Lisa didn't have any experience in bookkeeping, but she didn't ask any questions. To her, this was just one step closer to her dream of getting out of Buffalo for good. During the boys' football game, Billy would ask Jimmy if he knew how much money she was making. Billy didn't know what a bookkeeper even was. However, he did know that it paid a hell of a lot more than Shelley's. Jimmy couldn't answer Billy's question, nor would he dare try to find out the answer from his father. A fifth consecutive touchdown on the field by Jimmy signaled to everyone that it was time to go home. The boys said their goodbyes, and Jimmy began his familiar journey south. After walking a couple blocks, Jimmy began to feel the freeze penetrate his sweaty undershirt. He trudged faster down the brown-white sidewalks, partly buried in midwinter snow, which made him feel even more sweaty and cold. Jimmy was relieved when he finally saw larger houses, each with their unique high towers, since both were signs that he was getting closer to home. After a couple more blocks down narrower neighborhood roads, Jimmy finally arrived at his home on Robert Street, a Queen Victoria Anne mansion with a corn-yellow facade and red trim. He walked up his icy maroon stairway, almost sliding down the steps before grabbing the nearest pillar of the front porch. Once Jimmy regained his balance, he pushed the button next to the massive mahogany door and waited while listening to the sounds of amplified bells. Soon he heard the clicks from the unfastening of a padlock, following by the sliding sounds of two metal bolts. The door opened to a familiar red-headed woman with freckles and translucent skin. As soon as Mrs. Girardi opened the door, Jimmy could smell the hearty meat dish that was cooking in the kitchen. Jimmy hurried inside, and his mother quickly shut the front door behind him and proceeded to lock it. He sat down on the bristly rug in the entryway and fastened the laces of his snow boots. Jimmy looked at the chandelier above and wondered, as he always did, whether he would survive if the chandelier came crashing down. "I want you to run to the cellar and grab a can of peaches, and wash up before your father gets here," his mother said as she walked back to the kitchen. "Don't forget to get a flashlight. You almost fell last time, and I'll have time tonight to mend your bruises." Jimmy, observing his mother's instructions, opened one of the Edwardian chiffoniers in the living room to retrieve a flashlight. The cellar was pitch black, yet not significantly darker than the remainder of the Girardi house, that was only dimly lit by fluorescent lights. In an effort to circumvent Mrs. Girardi's migraines, any and all natural light that could enter the house was largely blocked out by heavy blackout curtains. The only sunlight that was able to enter the house came from a slim rectangular stained glass pattern above the doorway. This little light reflected a bluish hue on an alabaster Jesus that sat on a drum table. The cellar door was located in the middle of the hallway that connected the living room to the kitchen. The cellar door was similar to the front door, and that was reinforced with its own padlock and bolt lock. The padlock would typically be kept locked except for times like these, when Mr. or Mrs. Girardi would temporarily place the unlocked padlock on top of the Biedermeier next to the door. Jimmy opened the doorway to the cellar and shined the flashlight down the narrow concrete stairwell that led down to the underground floor. He dragged his hand across the gray wall as he carefully made his way to the light switch at the bottom. The light illuminated the plain brick walls that contrasted to the intricate wallpaper and eclectic molding that embellished the rooms upstairs. The concrete floor was equally as featureless as the walls, except for the circular floor drain in the center of the room. Jimmy walked to one of the shelves of the east wall that was stocked with various canned foods and bagged dry goods. Next to the shelves were two chest freezers stocked with meats, vegetables, and leftover meals from weeks and months before. Next to the west wall sat 20-gallon wooden crates of various cleaning supplies, boxes of latex gloves, and toilet paper. Next to the crates was a cox reel with a tightly wrapped hose, except for the line that emerged from an unknown source from the ceiling. Opposite the stairs was a Dayton portable power generator that was connected by 3 insulated conductors to an electrical box directly above. The generator powered the second room within the basement that was enclosed by an additional brick wall that divided the basement floor. The entrance to the second room of the basement was through a steel door that was kept locked at all times. Similar to his parents' bedroom, Jimmy was never allowed to enter the locked room in the basement that served as Mr. Girardi's wine cellar. The room was temperature controlled, and Mr. Girardi always emphasized that one negligent mishap could spoil his stock. Jimmy didn't like being down in the basement for too long. He didn't like the musty smells, the coldness, or the peculiar scratchy sounds of little creatures resonating from behind the walls. Jimmy was quick to spot the can labeled Del Monte, and once he grabbed what he needed, he quickly ran up the stairwell. He was relieved to be out of the basement, but his solace was short-lived. Jimmy, while closing the basement door behind him, felt a familiar sharp sting from a slap across his face. In the hallway was his mother, standing in her apron with a clean, blue and white pie tray in hand. "Where did you get this?" his mother screeched. Jimmy briefly looked into her lifeless gray eyes before directing his own to the floor. "I got it from the fridge," he answered. "You ate it?" hissed his mother. "I gave it to my teacher." "What if she broke it? What would you do then, huh?" Jimmy glanced at the bulging vein in the center of his mother's white temple. He knew better than to give a response. "Answer me!" she shrieked. I would buy a new one." "With what?" she screeched. "You can't make money. You can't do anything." Jimmy began to feel his warm tears roll down his cheeks and make their way into little drops on the floor. "Stop crying!" she yelled. Throughout the air were tiny particles of saliva that spread like a mini explosion. "Go upstairs!" Jimmy ran up the spiral staircase while hearing the echoing words of his mother. "You are lucky I don't tell your father." Jimmy closed the door to his room quietly. Inside, he began to hyperventilate while simultaneously collecting heavy snot on his sleeve and pant leg. He tried to conceal his tears, but the more he tried, the more it made his crying worse. But he needed to stop because any minute his father would be arriving home. Luckily, at times like these, Jimmy had a ritual up his sleeve that, when performed, would almost always give him an acute sense of tranquility. Underneath this bed in a World War II ammo container was his collection of football cards bearing the names of some of Jimmy's favorite players. Jimmy pulled out a stack and, by process of elimination, was able to find Jim Braxton and the Juice. Finding these names was enough to pull himself together in time before he heard the clacking metal sounds coming from the door downstairs. Mr. Girardi had arrived home. By the time Jimmy came downstairs to the dining room, his father had already situated himself at the head of the table. Per usual, he was sipping from his rocks glass, appearing indifferent to the hearty meal on his dinner plate. The violent clings between the glass and table after each consecutive sip signaled to Jimmy that his father was not in the best of moods. Mr. Girardi's obliviousness to the clinging drops of single malt scotch in his mustache also made it apparent that this was not his first alcoholic beverage of the evening. I think tonight it would be best to discuss Proverbs 25:1, said Mr. Girardi. Telling lies about others is as harmful as hitting them with an axe, wounding them with a sword, or shooting them with a sharp arrow. Mr. Girardi took another sip before slamming his glass against the table. He then turned to Jimmy, who had slightly jolted from the table's shockwaves. Junior, did you lie today? Jimmy looked to his mother, whose head was bound toward her plate. This reminded him of an educational film about lowland gorillas that he watched in school. In the film, the narrator said that you should never make eye contact with silverbacks, since one trivial glance in their direction could spiral them into a violent rage. Jimmy, with his head hung low, eyes fixed on his steak and mashed potatoes, replied to his father, "No, sir." "You better not be lying, especially to your father," said Mr. Girardi. "I'm not lying, sir," answered Jimmy. Mr. Girardi glared at his son for a moment before taking another swig. He then slammed the glass against the table and stared at the flickering candle centerpiece. "There was a liar at the site today. I'm not going to name any names because I don't do that. Other people might do that." He paused and took another sip of scotch. "But I know how much damage that can cause. I'm not going to reveal the name. Even that person deserves it. Deserves a punch across the face, too, if you ask me." "Would you like some more gravy, dear?" asked Mrs. Girardi. Mr. Girardi curled his upper lip, baring his large incisors. "I wasn't finished talking," he said slowly. "Don't interrupt me unless you want to smack yourself." Mrs. Girardi set the gravy boat down on the top of the white tablecloth. She then quietly pressed her napkin against her lap, stroking it repeatedly against her thighs. "As I was saying," said Mr. Girardi, if you lie, you can't... I can't think now." He glared at his wife, who continued to stare down at the napkin pressed against her lap. "Hello? Does she speak? Is anyone home?" The irritation in his voice had amplified. Mrs. Girardi looked up from her plate. "Yes?" she replied. "Then get some fucking ice in this glass," he screamed as he slammed his glass once more down on the table. Mrs. Girardi popped up from her seat and scurried to the kitchen with an empty cocktail glass in hand. The father then turned to his son and in a soft voice said, "Jimmy, see, that there wasn't good. That wasn't good of me. Your mother wasn't listening to me, but it's no excuse." He then paused to get out a heavy sigh and said, "You can't swear no matter how mad you get. Otherwise, that makes you a sinner too." Mrs. Girardi soon returned with the fresh glass filled to the top with ice cubes. As she laid the glass down, Mr. Girardi reached over the table to grip his wife's forearm. He wasn't forceful, yet he exerted enough strength to convey that the situation could change very quickly. He looked up at his wife and stated softly, "I'm sorry, but I'm a man in a lot of pain. You can understand how tired I am. I'm outside in the cold, trying to put food on this table." She smiled slightly and said, "I know." Mr. Girardi released his wife's arm and grabbed the scotch. He poured the liquid in his glass until it filled to the brim, spilling some on the white tablecloth in the process. He then took another swig, but this time he set the glass down just a tad more gently. "And I just want you to realize just how much stress I am under, and if people make rumors, lies about you, I mean, I've treated everyone with the utmost dignity and respect." Having lost his train of thought, he sat there heavily exhaling in a state of deep frustration. He then looked to his son, who was cutting off a fat piece of ribeye steak. He watched Jimmy chew the meat and quickly discovered a new cause of frustration. "Junior, the adults need to be alone right now. Go up to your room," he demanded. Jimmy sat up from the table and picked up his plate. Are you stupid? What did I say? Said Mr. Girardi. I was going to clean. Before Jimmy could finish his sentence, his father gruffed. Go to your room, I said. Your mother will do it. Jimmy set the plate down and hurried upstairs. Once he made it to the confines of his room, he debated whether it was worth it to take a bath. He knew that if he got stink and sweat in his bed, his mother would be furious. However, he could also clearly envision what his father would do if he used all the hot water. Since his father had been drinking heavily this evening, Jimmy decided to take the risk with the former. While in bed, Jimmy closed his eyes and tried to drown out the echoing sounds of glass clashing against cherry veneer. After about an hour of repetitive tossing, he was finally able to fall asleep. Jimmy went into a dream. Like many dreams before, he was in the Ralph Stadium, but unlike his other dreams, he was not on the field. Rather, Jimmy was in a locker room, and awe at the sight of all his heroes fastening their gear for their upcoming battle. A bright light beamed on Jimmy, and in unison, these locker room Goliaths greeted him with a, Hello, Jimmy. The players were all cordial and welcoming, including the great Jim Braxton, that surprised Jimmy with what he imagined as a fatherly pat on the shoulder. One tall black man with a square jaw and clean-cut high top was turning out to be not so kind. Contrary to the other players' warm smiles, the man gave off a patronizing smirk as if he was trying to tell Jimmy they had done something wrong. The mysterious man then opened his mouth, and in a voice reminiscent of Jimmy's father, the man said, You don't know what you're doing, do you? Jimmy wanted to respond, but the rules of his dream wouldn't let him. The man then laughed and said, Son, you are such a fake. Again, Jimmy tried but could not respond. In a menacing tone, the man said, Little boy bullshit. You know that? Jimmy began to hear the fluttering of his heartbeat. He tried to leave the locker room, and thought that maybe if he was able to get to the field, he could still have a pleasant dream that was rapidly deteriorating. The man sat up from the bench. His smirk was no longer there, and his face was gradually morphing into something quite terrifying. He gave out a loud snort and slammed his foot against the floor. Jimmy still could not move. The man gave out another snort, and then another. Jimmy tried kicking, flailing his arms, screaming, but it did nothing. The man started to move forward, and the faster he moved, the louder his incessant snorts became. Jimmy knew that the man would eventually make his way to him, but there was nothing he could do. Jimmy woke up. He was overcome with a mixture of nightmare adrenaline and dream-induced dopamine. He tried to go back to sleep, but couldn't get rid of that icky feeling from his sweaty pajamas that tightly gripped his skin. His temperature also felt high, and his throat was severely parched, yet he wasn't sure if he was sick. He was thirsty enough to risk waking up his parents to get a glass of water downstairs. Once he conjured the courage to get up from his bed, he left his room by slowly rotating the beehive knob of his bedroom door. He then made his way down the stairs, all the while bearing his weight on the handrail as to lessen the sound of each meticulous step against the creaky wooden planks. When he finally reached downstairs, Jimmy noticed a dim light emanating from the basement entrance. He looked further and saw that the door had been opened, and there, lying on the Biedermeier, was a padlock for the cellar. Jimmy stopped for a short moment, wondering whether his inebriated father had gone down to the cellar to get a bottle. He also wondered whether his father would return from the cellar, and more importantly, whether he would be angered by the sight of his son snooping around at such a late hour. Whatever the outcome would be, it didn't change the fact that Jimmy was still thirsty, so he told himself fuck it, and walked to the kitchen. He turned the faucet on to let the water cool before grabbing a tall glass tumbler from the cupboard. He then filled the glass up about halfway before he couldn't wait any longer. He tossed the water down, and the soothing sensation on his parched throat affirmed his visit downstairs was worth it. Little did he know, his moment of bliss would be gone soon. As Jimmy set down the empty glass in the kitchen sink, he was startled by a bleeding noise echoing from the hallway. At first, he thought it was his parents, but when he heard it cry again, he doubted whether the sound was even human. It sounded faint and sickly, like a calf in pain. Who was down there, he thought? Did an animal get into the house? These questions made his skin crinkle and the hairs on his arms stiffen. He thought about sprinting upstairs to tell his parents, but imagining the response made him contemplate doing nothing at all. Suddenly, a grunt echoed from the basement. However, this time the voice was very familiar. It was his father's. Jimmy's anxiety had entered a new dimension, as he was no longer worried about just himself. The sound of these grunts took Jimmy back to a time when his father caught the flu. He remembered his dad heaving over the toilet, expelling what was left of the alcohol and spoiled shrimp they enjoyed earlier that evening. He remembered his father was so weak that night, he could barely lift his hands off the pukey toilet rim. His father's frequent bouts of rage has always terrified Jimmy, but for whatever reason, the sight of his sickly father on the bathroom floor scared him even more. Jimmy couldn't stomach the thought of his father being hurt and wanted to help him more than anything. So Jimmy did what he believed any son ought to do. He sprinted toward the cellar door, yelling "Dad" at the top of his lungs. He lunged down the staircase, nearly missing each step before making it to the bottom. Standing on the basement floor, Jimmy was surprised to see that the metal door to the wine cellar was open, and for the first time in his life, he was able to see inside. Beyond the doorway was a small room consisting of 4 walls of red brick. The walls were protected by several sheets of chicken wire that covered every square foot. There were no bottles, cases, or barrels in the room, but a couple of stacked dirty plates that lay next to the entryway. In one of the back corners laid a single tin bucket, and in the middle of the room was a tattered cot held together by rusted springs. The springs were creaky and rattled loud and rhythmically, along with sounds of heavy grunts. One harsh fluorescent light bulb dangling from the ceiling illuminated his father's metal belt buckle that branched off his unzipped trousers. Mr. Girardi's legs were as bare and pale as his white cheeks that clenched from every thrust. His hands were also bare, except the tips of his fingers, partially hidden as he pressed them deeper into milky flesh. As Mr. Girardi squeezed her soft, shapely hips, she tightly gripped the metal edges of the cot and buried her face against the thin cotton padding. Like her body, her face was mostly pale with sporadic red spots, some more raised than others. Her skin was rather spongy, lumpy, and dimply, except for the skin that stretched tightly around her protruding tummy. Mr. Girardi grabbed a few locks of her greasy black hair and pulled her head back tightly, exposing the blue bruise along her prickly chin. However, upon discovering a collection of oil between his fingers, he quickly released her. He looked repulsed as he rubbed his digits, and with the same hand he jabbed her in the back of the head. Her head toppled back onto the cot, and now facing the doorway, Jimmy was able to lock eyes with her. Her peculiar expression seemed like she didn't notice him. There was no movement in her pupils or her eyelids, and although the color of her iris was clear amber, Jimmy was inclined to believe she was blind. Unfortunately, she was not blind, and in fact had seen for years unobstructed an intangible level of torment normally procured through multiple lifetimes. Other than the circadian experiences of sexual violence, her life for years was nothing but a series of compulsory activities merely to keep her living. That is not to say that she didn't have thoughts about ending it all. In fact, there was once a time she made a sharpened tool crafted with intertwined pieces of chewed chicken wire in preparation for turning her aspirations into reality. However, her plans quickly dissolved the day she woke up to throbbing breasts anteceding a menstrual cycle. She soon realized that she would once again become a mother and a vessel for a living thing of far greater value than herself. Although the thought of a child born predisposed to such a savage pathology was terrifying, Her hormonal inclinations combined with her fallacious sense of duty gave her the hope that this child had a modicum chance at normalcy. Perhaps if this child was sheltered from her house of horrors, then maybe it could curtail the chances of inevitably continuing a sadistic legacy. In the case of Jimmy, any inkling of innocence had been destroyed, and any remainder of his childhood was now as defiled as his father's cum-stained boxer briefs. Facing Jimmy, the woman began to open her jaw wide, exposing what was left of her decaying teeth. The floor of her mouth was bumpy and light pink, and tucked away near her tonsils was a mutilated piece of what remained of her tongue. This image, combined with the room's smell, reminiscent of a sour bready odor, was far too much. Jimmy's composure and sanity had finally broken. With a painful whimper, he cried, "Stop!" Jimmy's father turned around to see his son standing shakily near the staircase. Mr. Girardi's wide-eyed, fearful look quickly transformed into one of rage. Jimmy wanted to run up the staircase, but just like his dream, he couldn't get himself to move. His vision seemed to be getting blurry. He felt like fainting. He couldn't think. The only sound he could hear was the machine gun rhythms of his heartbeat. Suddenly, an enormous force pulled his arm forward, causing him to fall into a puddle of his own liquid. "What did I tell you about coming down here?" his father screamed. There on the floor, Jimmy felt a strong blow across his face, followed by another and another. "What did I tell you?" his father repeated. Jimmy, while on the floor, then heard the sounds of his own desperate attempts at inhaling oxygen, as well as the clashing of his father frantically unlocking one of the crates against the wall. When he finally got the courage to look up from the floor, he saw his father rushing towards him, holding what looked like a bottle of cough syrup. Mr. Girardi grabbed the hair on the back of Jimmy's head and pressed the open bottle tightly against his son's nostrils. With both hands, Jimmy clutched his father's veiny wrist and, using all the strength he had left, tried to push his dad's hand away. However, the more Jimmy tried to push, the faster he breathed in the sweet medicinal vapors that were escaping from the bottle. Jimmy began to feel dizzy. He eventually let go of his father's wrist as all of his limbs became limp. Jimmy woke up in the wee hours of the morning to the sound of his rooster alarm on his nightstand. In bed, he was now too tired to panic, or otherwise too disabled by an agonizing cluster of headaches. He tried rubbing his head, but the searing pain in his collarbone wouldn't allow him. He felt nauseous and laid in bed for a while, trying not to vomit. Lying there in pain, he dismissed any doubts that everything that previously unfolded was just a nightmare. The faint smell of coffee coming from downstairs made him feel sicker. Since his mother refrained from all forms of caffeine, he knew that it was his father who was down there in the kitchen. Jimmy got up from bed and, after much struggling, was able to get on his winter coat and trousers. He didn't need to bathe since he had somehow been miraculously washed the night before. For a moment, Jimmy imagined sprinting downstairs and heading straight out the door for school. He then imagined arriving home later that day to be viciously beaten for avoiding his father. So instead, he went downstairs to the kitchen and found exactly what he expected. His father reading the newspaper with a cup of senka in hand. Mr. Girardi peered his eyes up from the glasses that hung on the end of his nose bridge. He didn't seem distraught or angry in any way, and even carried a half smile on his face. With a friendly tone, he asked his son, "You want some cereal?" "I'm not hungry," Jimmy replied. "You need to eat, and I need to talk to you," said Mr. Girardi. "Eat that honeycomb your mother got you." Jimmy opened up the cabinet for the box of honeycomb on the upper shelf. As he stretched his arm to grab the cereal, he could feel the pain searing back up his collarbone. The pain was so bad that despite his restraint, Jimmy couldn't help but whimper. Having heard his son's agitation, Mr. Girardi looked up from his paper and asked, "What's going on?" "It's nothing," said Jimmy as he rubbed his shoulder. "It's nothing? Jimmy, what did you do?" Mr. Girardi placed his paper on the table and gave out a heavy sigh. I got so worked up last night. I guess I went a little overboard, and for that I'm sorry. But how many times have I told you that room is strictly off limits? With a squeaky high pitch, Jimmy said, Dad? Don't. Mr. Girardi raised his pointer finger and looked at his son sternly. You're wondering who in the heck that woman was downstairs. Am I right? Jimmy nodded. I would be a little alarmed if I were you too. What you saw with us, well, it was something that you'll get better later when you're older. But heck, sometimes I forget you're almost a man already, so you deserve to hear it. Mr. Girardi then gestured Jimmy to the empty chair across the table. Jimmy sat down reluctantly, placing his hands on his lap as he listened to his father. Jimmy, for reasons way beyond what we'll ever be able to understand, God has given some people, like Rebecca, a brain that it just doesn't work like yours or mine. The good Lord has its reasons that we can understand. And you know, I should have just told you this outright. She's here to give me and your mother a chance at having another child, and her parents are well aware that she's here. They're grateful that I have given her, a woman like her, the chance at a normal life. You know, Jimmy, that there is nothing more fulfilling in this world for a woman than having children, and I am giving her the opportunity. You and Mom want another kid? Asked Jimmy. Yes, we think you should have another brother. Why don't you have a kid with Mom? She can't, Jimmy. Rebecca can give us what we both want. But why is she down there? It's so small. Jimmy, she is only down there so she doesn't hurt yourself or you or your mother. She's not right in the head, Jimmy, and right now her job is to carry my child, your brother. Once she has given birth, she can go to the hospital. They will be better at dealing with her. Why doesn't she just live at the hospital now? Because they'll euthanize her, Jimmy. You know what euthanize means? No, not really. Well, I think it's like what happened to Rufus. Jimmy, don't. We're talking about a woman here, not a dog. Let's be clear about that, and not show disrespect. She has a brain that doesn't work, but she's still a person, so don't be making comparisons. Okay. So will they put her down when you send her back to the hospital? No, not now. There are laws in place for mothers. You can't euthanize mothers, so she can live at the hospital once she has the baby. Are you starting to understand? I think so. Why doesn't she have a... She was born like that, Mr. Girardi interrupted. Jimmy, I'm not gonna lie. I was pretty mad last night, but I realized that everything might have been a little much. And I think we need to go to a Bills game pretty soon. What do you think? Jimmy nodded slightly as he started to massage his shoulder. Damn it, Jimmy. You can't do that to your dad. You want to put some ice on that? I have to get to school, Jimmy replied. Well, it's cold out, so that'll help. If something hurts, you want it to be cold. But don't be rubbing it all day. You're a man doesn't baby an injury, so stop it now. Jimmy left for school, but once outside, the cold chill rolled down his neck and shoulders, giving an unpleasant feeling that refuted his father's medical prognosis. However, Jimmy's throbbing headache and severe heart palpitations earlier that morning had largely subsided. This relief from the side effects of the anesthetics provided Jimmy a brief moment of consolation, even to the point where he even believed a well-reasoned explanation for what had happened, in fact, existed. But the cold winds jabbed his shoulder like razor blades, and the pain brought him closer to reality and further away from catharsis. Jimmy inevitably had his doubts. Upon arriving to school, Jimmy saw Billy standing in the grassy patch in front of the entrance stairwell. For a brief moment, Jimmy felt a modicum of serotonin rush through the achy part of his body. He wasn't sure if he would tell Billy what happened, but the thought of talking to Billy about anything at this point gave him a feeling of consolation. Jimmy walked and greeted his friend with the familiar, "Hey, Billy," yet Billy did not respond. Jimmy figured that Billy couldn't hear him through his heavy earmuffs, but would soon learn that Billy could in fact hear perfectly. Upon walking closer to greet his friend, Jimmy saw within his peripheral a fist aiming towards his right eye. "You fucking pervert," screamed Billy. Jimmy toppled, hitting the side of his body against the ground. He pushed himself up off the snow, quickly returning to his feet. Before Billy could land another blow, Jimmy gave his friend a strong shove. Billy slid against the ice before losing his balance. "What the hell are you doing?" Jimmy screamed. Billy propped himself on his knees and screeched, "You're the son of a pervert, so I know you're a pervert." "What?" said Jimmy. "My sister got home last night. She was crying. She said your dad tried to touch her. She's not going back to work." "Where did she say he touched her?" "Don't you fucking dare, you know where." "Well, what if she's lying?" "She's not lying, she doesn't do that." "Well, that doesn't make any sense," Jimmy said. "I should have known you guys are freaks. You know people talk shit about your mom behind her back? They say she's a whack job." "No, they don't." "They do. And I was stupid enough to tell them to stop saying that. I can't believe I defended a prick like you. Here's your fucking ball." Billy threw the ball at Jimmy's face, only to ricochet off his friend's forearm. Jimmy wiped off the dirt-covered frost from his forearm and trousers as he trudged toward Mrs. Russo's classroom. When he entered the room, he was greeted with the tumultuous sounds of many rowdy children running about without consequence. He looked to Mrs. Russo's desk to see an empty chair. He also saw Billy, sitting menacingly at the front of the class with his fists tightly gripping a fresh sharpened pencil. Jimmy walked silently through the mosh pit of children until he made his way to the back of the room. A man in his mid-30s with a large mustache and a brown blazer entered the classroom. Jimmy had never seen this man, but did recognize the gray-haired, portly principal that followed behind him. The principal walked solemnly to the front of the class and said, "Good morning. I need everyone to take a seat. I have an important announcement." The principal stood there and waited while the children quieted down in their seats. "We were informed last night that Mrs. Russo has been in an accident. She was driving on the principal looked down and paused, and her tires slipped off into the road. Now, we are still learning what happened and what her condition is at the moment. We do know that she is in the hospital, and I, as well as some of the other faculty, will be visiting her today." "Can't she walk?" asked a girl in pigtails. "We don't know at this time." "Is she in a coma?" asked Jimmy. "I'm sorry, but at this time we don't know, which is why we want to get to the hospital today. What we do know is that she's not going to be coming back to the classroom for a while. That is why Mr. Owens is here. He'll be filling in her shoes until Mrs. Russo recovers and is able to come back to teaching." The principal concluded, "I will be unavailable throughout most of the day as I will be visiting Mrs. Russo. Like I said before, I'll give everyone an update tomorrow when I find out more. I promise you all that. But I need you guys to promise me that you will show Mr. Owens some respect during his time here. Is that understood?" In unison, the goody two-shoes answered, "Yes, Mr. Taylor." "Good. I hope everyone has a nice day, and please try to stay focused on your work. That is all." The principal departed, and Mr. Owens made a lackluster introduction before calling on a random student to roll out the film projector. For the remainder of the class, they watched Heritage of Splendor. Meanwhile, Mr. Owens sat at his desk, intermittently shuffling random papers before settling on reading the sports pages of the Buffalo News. When the bell rang for recess, Mr. Owens asked another random kid in the front row for break time, for which the kid replied, 20 minutes. He then shoved a pack of Winstons in a snow jacket as he prepared for the horrible weather outside. His plans to leave the class, however, would be shortly interrupted by Jimmy, who already made his way to the front of the class. "Mr. Owens," said Jimmy, "could I please talk to you for a sec?" Uh, Mr. Owens replied. "Can it wait until tomorrow? I just got here, so I'm pretty busy." "I wanted to ask you." Before Jimmy could finish the sentence, Mr. Owens put his hand up and pointed to the multiple bruises scattered on Jimmy's face. "Geez, where'd you get that shiner?" Mr. Owens asked. "What?" asked Jimmy. "Look at your face, kid. Your face is all sorts of banged up. What happened?" "Oh, my friend and I got into a fight," said Jimmy. "Well, damn. I hope for his sake you got the best of it," said Mr. Owens. The two stood there awkwardly for a while, until Mr. Owens said, "Anyway, what did you want to ask me?" "I wanted to ask you what happens to people who go to mental asylums." Mr. Owens, peering his eyes at the classroom exit, said, I don't know anything about that." "Well, I just want to find out." Mr. Owens interrupted. "Look, what's your name?" "Jimmy." "Jimmy, I got a lot of stuff to do today. I just got here, and honestly, you don't really need to know about that stuff. Is this for a school project?" "No," replied Jimmy. "Then there you go. You don't really need to know this stuff. I would ask Ms. Russell. When she gets back, she'll probably help you. But right now, I really have to go outside before class starts. I have a lot to do." Jimmy nodded. There was then a moment of silence as Jimmy began to space out at the octopus-shaped water stain on the ceiling. Mr. Owens placed his cigarette in his mouth and mumbled, "You gotta get going, too. I won't be back until break ends, and I can't have you in here by yourself." Jimmy went outside like he was told, but he didn't go to the schoolyard. He didn't go to the cafeteria or the gymnasium either. Instead, he went east to Elmwood Street, and then north, and then west, and then north again. The snow was falling heavily on these barren sidewalks, and didn't seem like it was going to let up anytime soon. Jimmy didn't have a destination in mind, but the more he walked, the less he felt his aches and pains, so he kept on walking. He thought about maybe reaching Niagara Falls, since it was so beautiful this time of year. The freezing dry air and all the ice floating atop the river made it all seem so clean. But come summer, when the ice and snow were all gone, the putrid smell of rotting sewage would come up to the surface, and everyone would smell what was underneath.